All right, guys. One of the things I've noticed for smallmouth during the post spawn the last few years, at least on my river system, and you could comment as to whether or not it happens on your river system or not, especially with the male smallmouth, is it's one of those windows where right after the spawn or in the early post spawn, they tend to not like the rock, okay, as much. And I've kind of attributed that the last couple years based on the number of males caught in areas in the river where you normally don't catch them. Like a sandy bottom. A lot of times, smallmouth and most river systems don't like that sandy bottom. They prefer that rock substrate and things like that. But during the early post-spawn period for a lot of smallmouth, especially males, because of all the activity they have done, clearing beds and doing all that stuff, for the females, they tend to not like to be around rock as much, and for obvious reasons, right? Usually you're catching some of those males that have been, rubbing that tail all along the bottom, right? To form up the beds, right? And so during that post spawn period, they tend to not want to be around any of that pea gravel or any of that rock. They really are being located now, especially the bigs, really where it's more sandy. It's more of a soft bottom. And because I just think it's a little bit more supportive for them in terms of after they've gone through the spawn, right? Because the males are peeling off and they're going to go off while the females have been remaining on the bed. And then, of course, the females come off the bed and then they feed up really, really heavily. But in that window, in that transition period, the males move off. And the last thing they want to be doing is hovering over or having, around rock, right? They want to be around a soft substrate or a soft sandy bottom for a little while as they themselves recover, from that spawning period. And during that transition, when those males are moving, obviously the swim jig is probably one of the most popular baits for jig anglers anyway, during that period. As they are located, maybe they may be a lot more aligned to the bottom, and you can use that swim jig. And one of the setups that's really, really cool, it's really great packaging from Jackall, is the B-crawl setup. This B-crawl setup, it's basically the swim jig, and I don't see very many of these around. Certainly don't see very many of the B-crawl in the States around retail. But I really haven't seen a lot of the American producers or manufacturers actually putting together like kits like this, where basically it's your swim jig and then you've got two trailers, right? You certainly don't have to always go. This is pretty big for my, when I'm fishing for smallies, this is great for largemouth. Obviously you guys know that this coloration pattern, the pinks, pretty hot color for 2025. But you certainly could change out that trailer. And one of the trailers that I would recommend if you're going to run any swim jig during this post-spawn period or during this really hot, we got expected 95 to 105 degree temperatures all up and down the eastern seaboard, is to go with the O.S.P. Let's go with the Dewlight Beaver. This is a 3-inch. And a 3-inch is a perfect trailer, perfect size. They've got a bunch of sizes in this particular bait from O.S.P. You can use it. I mean, I've used it on Ned rigs. I've used it just flat out free rigged. I've used a Neko rig. I've used a whole bunch of different ways in this 3-inch for smallmouth because it's a perfect size for that. So that's just another option. You don't have to go with the bigger trailer. You can put your favorite trailer on. But with any swim jig, but I just have begun to really like the Jackall swim jigs. It's not one of their most popular items, obviously, in their lineups, which is probably why you're not going to see it on a lot of shelves where you are, potentially. You may have to order it online. This is the 3/16. But I just kind of love it, man. It works. Obviously, this color is a huge deal this year. It also comes in a few other colors as well. But you can obviously use any swim jig to locate these, especially the males early in the post spawn, and then you're going to get the females transition away. But just keep in mind, those smallmouth are not going to move that far initially. The first 7 to 10 days post spawn, during that interim post spawn period, they're going to stay pretty close to the spawning flat or that spawning areas. So find like seams and find like areas or structure, and those sandy soft bottoms for the males that are pretty adjacent, pretty close to nearby where you locate beds. And you can find that even if you locate beds that are obviously, are spawned out and been abandoned, the females are gone. That gives you a good indication of where to start to look, in terms of locating them again, especially in June. I'm a big believer in the second spawn. I believe our smallies spawn more than once. And so I'm going to be interested to see how many beds I see this weekend coming up, especially as the water has come back down to lower levels like 2.5 feet, 3 feet. And the water's going to clear up after all that high water we had. The water should be clearer, and we're going to be able to see those the abandoned beds. But we're also going to start to see new beds, and that's what happened the last 2 years on the Upper Potomac and on the Monocacy. Is we had spawns in June and July, and I believe they were secondary spawns. So the transition still applies, right? I'm assuming that beds get remade, but I don't know if that's always the case in these secondary spawns. They could use prior beds that have remained. That's stuff that's a great biological study for those folks that do that kind of stuff at the university and stuff. But we know we've seen beds in late June and July after the 4th of July. And of course we saw in the same beds in the same areas in April and in May. So we know, that something's happening. And this could also contribute to the population. Why on the Upper Potomac the population has seemed to come back so much in the last few years after the 2018 big major flood. And it could possibly be because these smallmouth, a portion of them are spawning multiple times during the summer. And that may attributed to, the recent catches and the recent abundance of what we've seen in the last couple years of the just prolific 12, 13, 14-inch smallmouth from years past. They're now reaching that length, the amount of them, especially in time frames when we had less than optimum spawns, yet now we've got significant 12 to 14 inch populations now. That tells you something's different. Okay. And so maybe it'll bear itself out in the surveys that are going to be conducted coming up in the next year or two. But we also have a significant number of 19 and 20 inch smallmouth. Okay. Especially in the Potomac River and in the Upper Potomac. And I believe that is stemming from these populations and something happening with that. Because we know how many years it takes for these smallmouth to get to that 19, 20 inch level. And so they've weathered the storm, so to speak, of all this multiple flood stage events and high water events. And so in terms of a population, there had to have been a significant number of population, in terms of that portion that survives based on the number that we're actually seeing now in the river system. But you want to check out B-Crawl. Talk to your independent tackle shop that carries Jackall and see if they can't get you some B-Crawl in, on a special order or something like that. Always try to go with your independent tackle shop first. See if they can get it from their distributor before you go online or before you pay the shipping costs and all that stuff, the custom duties, all that stuff from trying to get it from, direct from Japan, which is obviously, can be costly, especially now with tariffs and things like that and delays with customs in the supply chain. But just talk to your independent tackle shop first. It's called the B-Crawl Setup Swim Jig. Comes with 2 trailers. It's got awesome information on the back on how you can rig it. It's really great. You shouldn't have any problem finding the O.S.P. It's pretty much on a lot of retail shelves, especially your more well-known national tackle shops that actually also do online sales. You should readily be able to find the O.S.P. 3-inch. Comes in 4.5, I think. They might even have a bigger one. But the 3-inch or smallmouth is really your optimum size. So check that out. Give that a go. Remember, try to find those sandy bottoms here in June. just check those out. Don't pass them by like you might usually, because normally, smallmouth aren't hanging around sandy bottoms. But after that spawn, it actually can be a pretty good area, especially for the males. The females are coming off, or they may be on the beds, and you may not want to target the females on the beds. I mean, I specifically do not like to target spawning fish, but I do like to target the males. So once you find the beds, or you find that, you then can move away adjacent to areas, find some sandy areas or some less rocky substrate, and you're likely going to find quite a few males there, because they also have to recover from the spawn in terms of generating the bed, in terms of, doing those things that they've done as well. Guarding and all that stuff. They're in a little recovery mode as too. It's not like they just pop right back. They do pop back faster than the females, obviously. But just check out those areas adjacent to your spawning area first. Because a lot of times they do not move for a week or two that far away from where the females spawn from. All right, guys.